Ms Ellen, I was asking you about the treatment orders that you have in place in Victoria. Is there some particular way in which sexual exploitation of children is dealt with in Victoria?
Not necessarily through orders or therapeutic treatment orders, but certainly in Victoria we've paid an enormous amount of attention in recent years to sexual exploitation.
In what way?
So specifically, really since 2007, I think we've really worked very, very hard to define exploitation as a form of abuse rather than as what might have been previously described as promiscuity or indiscriminate sexual behaviour, prostitution. And so we've, tried to redefine the language and again reflect that young people who are involved in exploitation come from traumatised and difficult and frequently abusive backgrounds, so that in redefining that language we also then have built a range of processes that allow us to better identify exploitation and respond to it.
How do you respond to it?
So our responses particularly are that we do require our workforce every time they are concerned about a young person being exploited, they need to fill out a Category 1 incident report and we log that. That enables us to, measure the prevalence of sexual exploitation. It allows us to do a lot of linking work with police and disruptive work with police.
What do you mean by disruptive work?
So in working with the police, we share information so that they can literally disrupt offenders who may be seeking to exploit our children. So particularly in identifying them, we will deliver harbouring notices. We use every possible offence we can.
What's a harbouring notice?
So essentially we advise the alleged perpetrator where they're known that this child is in state care, that they are underage, and that they are to desist from contact, or that they could be facing offences. So that we, in doing so, we make them know that they're observed and that we're watching them and that the police are interested in their behaviour. So we try and prevent further abuse from happening, even if we may not have got to the point of a prosecution being possible.
What if you discover sexual exploitation of a child against another child or young person in out-of-home care? How do you deal with that? In the same placement?
That absolutely requires a Category 1 incident report as well, so that we would then be bringing attention to the fact that we have a client who is at risk and a client who potentially is in need of therapeutic input. And so through that process of alert, we go about building we do an investigation of that client-to-client abuse. One or other needs to be moved. That therapeutic treatment is available for both in terms of...
How do you therapeutically treat the child or young person who is exploiting or abusing the other child or young person?
So ultimately we'd be looking to get sexually abusive behaviour treatment services to them wherever possible. So through our CASAs we'd be attempting to refer them for treatment, or if they're in fact involved with other mental health providers, we'd be advising them of their behaviours.
Is the treatment the same for the one who's receiving the abuse and the one who's giving it?
No, I think some of the fundamentals might be the same in terms of how the approach to treatment is given, but ultimately therapeutic treatment for the victim is quite different from the perpetrator, in that with the perpetrator we're trying to build empathy and understanding of what their behaviour involves and getting them to account for their behaviour fundamentally.
To tell them it's wrong. To
tell them it's wrong and to try and reset what their understanding of normal and appropriate sexual behaviour is for a child of their age.
Ms Worth, is that an issue for you in the sexual assault centres? Do you receive referrals and treat people who sexually abuse others, particularly children who sexually abuse other children?
Yes, probably the bulk of the referrals that come into Sabbats are about obviously children who've been abused by other children, and then some of the behaviours come out as sexually abusive behaviour.
But do you have the children who have abused come to your service as well?
Yes, and the victims, often the same ones, you're quite right, but we obviously run different programs. Yeah.
So are the programs different for those?
Yeah, they are different. I mean, with victims, you tend to assist them to deal with what's happened to them with their trauma, you know, and make sense of it and stop acting out if they're starting to act out. With kids or young people who've got sexually abusive behaviours, one, you want them to take some responsibility. You also want them, as Dale mentioned, to understand what their triggers are and what causes that behaviour. So the beginning process is often a quite long, a 6-week assessment process, really, to get some sense of what's been happening for them in their life before this happened, this incident. And then you really go through with them the responsibility they need to take for that. We occasionally do that group programs, but mostly in one-on-one therapy. And you want them to get a sense of how to live a good life, really, you know, how to move on, how they will go, where they will go from here.
Thank you. Just back to you, Ms. Allen. You're probably aware that the young children who gave evidence on Monday spoke of the key need of theirs was to have a trusting relationship with an adult, and that was often not available to them because the number of times they moved from placement to placement and the changes in the workers who had some case management responsibility for them. What does your department do to facilitate children in out-of-home care having access to that trusting relationship?
I think the most fundamental thing is that we've recognised the significance of that in recent times. So, and the I guess risk factor associated with sexual exploitation and sexual abuse that people are lacking in critical relationships. So most of our out-of-home care services now put a much greater focus on the need to develop trusting relationships. Whenever children enter out-of-home care, one of the emphasis is placed on identifying critical people that children do have relationships with, and that may be their family of origin. So when they come into care, asking them to identify the 3 or 4 people who are of most significance to them. We really are encouraging that through our training so that we can build and maintain on those relationships. So it doesn't always have to be the introduction of someone new to a child's life, but the auntie or the grandma who's always been there for the child. Questions like, who do you get birthday cards and Christmas cards from? Who have you known the longest in your life? Who would you trust most in your life? So that's often the starting point for children who come into care. Where there's obviously an absence, we are trying to work hard to stabilise our out-of-home care system where carers are less likely to be, the workforce is less likely to be casualised.
So the workforce, you meaning your workforce? Or
I'm talking now about the out-of-home care workforce and in particular residential care where, as the young people indicated, there's often change in the workers that work with them.
Just stopping for a moment. Residential care facilities are operated by the department or the non-government sector?
In all but the case of Hurstbridge Farm in Victoria and the Secure Welfare Service, they're all operated by the non-government sector.
And do you, in your contracts you have with the non-government service, have any conditions placed in relation to staffing numbers and what they could do to have retention of greater focus?
Essentially, there are requirements about staff-children ratios and at different times. So depending upon the type of residential care, there are requirements about staff-children ratios and at different times. So depending upon the type of residential care being provided, There now be stand-up staff overnight is one such example, so that residential staff who are working in all of our 4-bed units are available, recognising the fact that these traumatised children are often triggered at night and need extra support at night.
What have you done with those NGOs to encourage, if not ensure, that there is a continuity of staff for the residents?
Continuity of staff. Essentially, we encourage and work with the non-government sector to look at ways they can better retain their staff through staff supervision and support, through additional training and education being provided. We've assisted with specific funding for the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, deliver many mandatory modules of training and other forms of training that better equip staff to come at their work in a more satisfactory manner.
Not burn out as often.
That's right. That's right.
The staff.
To equip staff to come at their work in a more satisfactory manner.
Not burn out as often.
That's right. That's right.
The staff that you're referring to, these are the staff of the residential care placements.
That's right.
So through the various non-government services. Are you able to assist us with the breakdown in terms of numbers in out-of-home care as between, so you gave us that figure of 7,700?
Children in care.
Children in out-of-home care, kinship care and residential care?
Yes, I can. I can probably provide the detailed number if that's required. But ultimately, we have about 50% of all of our children are placed in kinship care in Victoria. A very small number, and it's approximately 500, are in residential care, and the remainder are in foster care. So a very small number are in residential care. I think it equates to something like 7%.
And of those 500 children that are in residential care, what are you able to say about the ages of those children, firstly?
The vast
more
majority,
likely to be adolescents?
They are. So in Victoria, what we aim for in our policy is that wherever possible, children under 12 are not placed. In rare circumstances, they can be placed, but generally speaking, you're talking about a very small number of the 500. So I think the more recent count is a couple of percent, 2-3% might be under 12. Generally, those children would have incredibly complex behaviours that mean they're unable to be placed in a family-based or a family home-based care placement, and or they're part of large sibling groups where the intention is to try and keep them together and they otherwise wouldn't be cared for well in home-based care.
And that of that group, and you've already described them as the most complex and most traumatised, with respect specifically to the question about attachments and ongoing trusted persons for that group, what are you able to say to us about how regularly you assess that as being achieved or at least achievable with some work? That is, having that trusted person in that young person's life.
There's a couple of things I think we use as strategies to ensure that happens. One is that most of those children who would be in that circumstance would be in our therapeutic residential care environments where we work very hard. Part of that model is that there are specialist consultants and therapists who are available to the care team, and part of the emphasis would be helping the care team and all of the practitioners to identify who the child might trust and how best to develop meaningful and restorative relationships with the children. So part of the intervention is always for all children in out-of-home care, but particularly the children in residential care and with the more complex behaviours, to identify and build trusting relationships wherever we possibly can. In addition, residential care and with the more complex behaviours, to identify and build trusting relationships wherever we possibly can. In addition, the role of the care team in Victoria is very, very important. So we expect that for all children in out-of-home care, the care team, which will consist of all the professionals working with the child, their carer, their parents, will assist in identifying where we can better build relationships for that child. So it could be emphasis on a school teacher, a relative, or where there's an absence of an existing person, we might look to mentoring services or a special professional in the child's life.
In terms of figures, Mr. Tolliday, can I ask you how many children and young people you treat on an annual basis?
At any point in time with our 3 services, we would have in the vicinity of 80 to 100 children.
At any point in time. So on an annual basis, how many will have gone through your program?
Well, that would be slightly greater than half of that number with the 2-year time frame. Some take less, not many longer, so 40 to 50 for those 3 programs.
Is that a figure that represents capacity for you?
Yes. Our capacity in the end gets defined by the hours in the day and the time it takes to work with the young people at our services. Our rural services do outreach work, which takes people out of the office for long periods of time to see a small number of children in relatively remote locations. For example, from the Dubbo office, one of the circuits that they do over 3 days each fortnight is about 1,500 kilometres and goes to several communities. So we have a lower level of productivity by going out than say, the Sydney office, which has the highest concentration of people coming in.
Thank you. Thank you, Iman, for...
Thank you. So just a few matters to go back to, and perhaps starting with you, Mr. Tolliday, and I'll ask Ms. Worth and also Ms. Brennan just to comment on this. Would it be fair to say that in earlier times, during the development of programs in particular, such as the treatment programs for children displaying sexually abusive behaviour, that the services were reluctant to take in children and young people unless they had stable placements?
Not in relation to the New Street services. In fact, not having a stable placement might actually be a factor that would escalate them in terms of priority. The Sydney service was the first service, and the first criteria we were given if we exceeded our capacity, which actually happened from day one, was that we have early intervention. Well, we immediately saw early intervention as being an issue that might be attached to a younger age, and then we saw complexity of issues faced by the young person. Instability of placement in terms of sexual harming behaviour is a very well acknowledged risk factor. So it shouldn't be, and for us it never was, an issue of whether a young person could be taken into the program. However, we did need an adult sponsor or person, an adult attached to the young person.
To get them there.
To get them in, and also participate and support the young person through the process.
When you talk, I'll come back to each of you to comment on that, but I'll just ask Mr. Tolliday this first. When you talk about a holistic approach to treatment, and you've mentioned that a couple of times, can you expand for us on what that means?
Yes, it means considering the wider context of the child's life and development, so who their family is, their identity, their family's identity, the community in which they live. For Aboriginal young people, it means their mob, family, country, language, culture, It includes looking at the various domains of a young person's life, so they have family, school, social, as well as their individual personal development. In period past 20 years ago, treatment of young people with behaviour.
It implies there was a time when that wasn't the approach.
Correct. It was very much intrapsychically focused, as if there was a problem that the child was carrying within themselves, and that needed to be assisted through a psychological process with the child. Now, that's an important element of the intervention. However, the child does live in a developmental framework with carers around them and with frequent interactions between their sexual behaviours and their environment.
What caused that change in approach?
I'm not sure what caused the change, but the change internationally seems to have come from Australia and New Zealand. And in North America at the moment, there's a shift in focus from institutional responses and residential responses to children with sexually harmful behaviours to looking at earlier intervention, family-based, community-based interventions within a holistic framework. So that seems to be becoming the norm.
Ms Worth, can I pass to you first on this question about stability of placement for that part of the program that delivers to, to both the child who has been abused and the child or young person who is engaged in the abusive behaviour.
When I started 23 years ago, so it was 1992, the first thing I was told was we didn't see children who were in unstable placements, which seemed quite extraordinary because we had a large number of reports and children sent in from Child Protection. So I was in a position to change it, and we changed that really quickly to if they didn't know where they were going to be living in 3 weeks' time, that probably wasn't an optimum time to start therapy, but anything more stable than that, we would see them. In terms of the sexually abusive treatment services, they didn't start with us till 2001, and by that time that had well and truly passed. So
that issue about stability
the
of
issue
placement.
about stability of placement, and it never seemed sensible. It just seemed a way to manage waiting lists, to be quite honest.
And the other issue about the holistic approach, I think you used that language too, so it's obviously language now that has permeated the treatment services generally.
Look, I think that's true. I think there was a time where young people with sexually abusive behaviours were, well, originally were seen as just going through a stage and everyone thought it had passed, and clearly it didn't, because some of them, when they got older, ended up in jail. And then I think we moved to seeing them as short adults, so they'd almost taken the way of dealing with offenders to deal with young adolescents. And then, as Dale said, I'm not sure why that changed, but slowly there was a change of opinion and there was some research done, and people started to use a more holistic approach, saying you have to look at young people's families and schooling and what's happened to them before they've got to this stage to actually be able to bring about some change. And the other thing we started to know was that you could actually move adolescents off the path they were heading down. Now, maybe if you're 30 and you're a serial rapist, we can't move you off that path. We can just lock you up for a long while. But that young people could be changed, their direction could be changed. And the research seemed to show that you would not continue sexual offending, you might actually continue offending. You know, you'd actually do burglaries or steal cars, but you wouldn't be into victim crimes.
Thank you. Ms Brennan, do you want to come in on this too?
Well, I think that because our services are different, so we do have a sexual assault service that does work with children who are survivors or victims of sexual abuse and also who have problem sexual behaviours or. So we would be trying to, again, look at a holistic approach of supporting the people who are...
Meaning the same thing?
Yeah, so and in some way a child-centred approach, recognising that a lot of young people, whilst they may not have a lot of power in their lives to actually be able to facilitate a lot of change, and it's really important that they're that there's people around them who acknowledge that and who support them. So yes, certainly we'd work in that way. Educationally though, we went from trying to work with children and young people to trying to work with the systems around them. So whilst we still work with children and young people educationally, because it's important that that informs our practice.
So when you say educationally, do you mean in schools?
In schools, in
delivering
groups.
What's generically referred to as protective behaviours programs? I know they have different names.
Sure. So yeah, what we'd call, respectful relationships education. Some of it would be, curriculum-based education, and some of it would be what is sometimes called protective behaviours education. So yes, sometimes that's in a school, sometimes that's in a childcare setting, sometimes that's in, for children and young people who are living in care in a group setting in that way. But what we have tried to do is actually work with the adults and carers who are around them and provide the education and training for those people. So yes, we still do see young people because we need to be able to know what best practice is and to understand where developmentally young people are at. But we spend a lot of time trying to work with the professionals and the carers around young people around this issue.
So how many young people would be in your programs at the moment, either as young people who have been sexually abused or are involved in sexually abusive behaviour?
So that's quite difficult to say. So with our sexual assault service at the moment, we have about 6 workers and our books are full. So, and they go through seeing people sporadically and then through seeing people, over 2 years. With regards to our education services and seeing children and young people, we see up to 15,000 young people a year.
This is going into schools.
Yeah, and I know that that's not necessarily something that we're focusing on here because we're talking about children and young people in out-of-home care. But for some of those children, that's the way they enter into working with us. So it will be with their guidance officers at school. So we work with a lot of guidance officers and counsellors in schools who end up being quite a close support system for children in out-of-home care. The other people in...
sorry, just to understand that, when you say you end up working with those children, is that because they've disclosed in the wake of the delivery of the program?
Or the school has asked us to come in and support a student to be able to stay at school. So there may be some children who are displaying problem sexual behaviours at school or who people feel they're at risk with regards to issues like child exploitation. And so the schools themselves will ask us to come in and to try and help that child be able to stay in school and not leave school.
What do you do?
What we do is look at a systems approach to helping that child feel safe at that school, find teachers and support people around that student who can help them be part of the educational process. So we just put around them really a system so that they can still go to school, and so there's adults at that school who can help them and look out for them and also give them help at trigger times, so whether that be lunchtime or break times, so that young person isn't suspended or excluded from school.
You gave us an answer before about the sexual assault service being in Cairns.
Yes.
Are we correct in understanding that you're not the only service working in Queensland?
Correct.
So there are a range of other services working in the same sorts of areas as your service?
So there are, so the sexual assault services in Queensland have a different way of working. So some of those sexual assault services will be adult-only services, mainly working with women. There are also some services in Queensland that do work with children and families who are in the child protection system or at risk of entering the child protection system. So yes, we are not the only sexual assault service that works with children and young people who may be experiencing sexual abuse, or children and young people who may have problem or abusive sexual behaviours.
Thank you.
But it's not as far down the track I would say, as a lot of the services are in New South Wales and in Victoria. We in Queensland have a lot more in common probably with the work that's being done in the Northern Territory or Western Australia, where a lot of the work might be more community-based or program-based rather than therapeutic work.
Rather than actually engaging one-on-one with the children and young people?
Where they're coming to an office and going into, a counselling space. So, yeah, so that there will be some... what will be happening is that there may be more mobile programs that are out there where you'll have people who are able to work with young people who are at risk, and yes, those young people may also have problem sexual behaviours. So that's why a lot of our work is in working with people who are already working with and seeing children and young people and trying to expand those professionals' repertoire so that if they already are seeing children and young people, that they can feel more confident and comfortable working with children who are, entering the of concern range. And then if they need to be referred on after that therapeutically. But not all children and young people are going to be able to see a therapeutic service.
So just on that, you gave an answer to Ms Vanessa before about being available to kinship and foster carers.
Yes.
For what sounded like basically crisis calls.
Yes, absolutely. So a foster and kinship carer will ring us because they're distressed about what's happening in the home, and they require support. And so we will try and talk them through some strategies and services, and then link them back into the department or their service provider, who really are the people who are the case managers of with them, of their young person that they care for. People will ring us because they need some confidence, and they really want somebody who's an expert with regards to talking to children and young people about sexuality. So they may actually, ring us in crisis or ring us in distress because they want to have a practical, down-to-earth conversation, even about things like, well, what would I say now? What words would I use? Rather than necessarily going straight into what they might be concerned will be a larger intervention.
What does that mean?
Well, sometimes there's a few things. Sometimes they've tried for a really long time to get support through the department, and they may not find it as practical and down to earth as what they require, and so they may be coming to us because they just they want that. And then there's some other services, some other times, or when they're concerned that the child will get again sent to another service and another group, and they'll be put on rounds of having to take this child that they care for to a series of services that may not assist.
Is that something that your service experiences regularly?
That people are exhausted of looking for help?
Yes.
Yes.
And the people specifically are foster carers and kinship carers?
Yes, so foster and kinship carers who are doing this work 24/7 and who are sometimes just looking for the skills to be able to do that 24/7 stuff, rather than doing, when there's a triggered event or a trauma event. They're really looking for assistance with, she's about to get her period. She has experienced this many issues in the past. How am I going to assist this young woman have her period in a way that isn't necessarily going to be traumatic or triggering? Because the advice is usually centred solely on the sexual abuse issues or the protected behaviours issues, not on the, well, how do I help her negotiate safe sex or, contraception.
All right. Ms Allen, I'm not sure whether or not you were present when when we were hearing evidence from the foster care and kinship care groups.
No, I wasn't present.
All right. So, in essence, without doing an injustice to them, this issue with respect to the availability of expertise and guidance to them certainly came up before the Commission. What do you say about the availability of that sort of guidance and assistance to foster carers and kinship carers, who on your figures are doing the bulk of the caring for children in out-of-home care in Victoria?
So there's a couple of things I'd say. One is in Victoria, all of our foster carers are supported by foster care workers, in addition to the young person having their own allocated child protection worker. Kinship carers are generally supported by the child protection staff, or in some situations they might be contracted to what's kinship carers are generally supported by the child protection staff, or in some situations they might be contracted to what's called the kinship advice and support service, so it can be contracted to a special service. But in all instances, care and the children have...
Placed inside the department or in the agency that's contracted by the department?
So in foster care, it's by the non-government organisation to provide foster care. They have their own foster care worker, and the child potentially, unless the case is contracted, will have their own child protection worker. And in kinship cases, the vast majority are managed by child protection, but some carers also receive contracted services by the non-government sector as well. I think it's fair to say that wherever possible, child protection would be through the care team approach that I mentioned earlier, be trying to assist the carers to provide the optimal level of care they possibly can, and to respond to any needs that carers have where they can. And where that's not possible, to refer to therapeutic services, whether that be for sexually abusive behaviour services, mental health treatment services for the young person, and so forth. So it really is an individualised, case-by-case, case planning responsibility, where people are trying to look at the individual needs of the child and develop a service system around that child.
So are you satisfied that the issue that Ms Brennan has raised with respect to foster carers and kinship carers getting exhausted by searching for a helpful response in times of crisis is something that's appropriately addressed in Victoria?
Look, I think in terms of carers being satisfied with the level of service and support they receive, I'd acknowledge that they're certainly not, and there's more we need to do. I think in terms of bringing services more quickly... Specifically in relation to children with very complex behaviours, including sexually abusive behaviours, I think there are occasions where we need to move more quickly, where the services are not always readily available. So I think we heard yesterday about services in regional and rural areas where they're not as readily available as they might be in metropolitan areas, and wait lists being more pronounced. So I think service coverage, accessibility, timeliness, they're all things that we need to continue to improve and monitor in terms of wait lists and bringing services as quickly as we possibly can. The other thing I'd say is that, particularly in relation to assisting care, we would acknowledge that we need to do far more work in assisting all form of carers and care types to develop their skills and knowledge about how to talk to children about healthy relationships and sexual education.
So what are you doing about that?
So that's part of a very detailed work plan that we have at the moment, and an objective that we have for the next 12 months to actually work with our on a whole of government approach to develop healthy relationships programs that can be offered outside of the school environment. I think for quite a long period of time, both the general community and out-of-home care providers have expected that the education program will take a lot of the lift and provide those programs to children. However, what we know is that many of our children in out-of-home care, particularly if they enter during adolescence, miss out because they're not good school attenders. Having carers who may not be as stable as we'd like, being able to have conversations about sexuality, healthy relationships, picking the right time, is really delicate and sensitive, and I think we need to do, in terms of our out-of-home care system in Victoria, more work to develop an approach that is more adaptable and flexible for the needs of those children who don't always have trusting relationships, have been subject to abuse, don't necessarily respond to formal education processes, classroom settings, group settings, and where we need to offer that sort of education more opportunistically in very quick quick turnaround according to what they need at that particular moment. So it could be in a car where we're driving right now and they ask the question. We need to make sure our workforce is able to readily respond.
And that's what Ms Brennan's identifying, I think, that carers,
Really
whether
need.
they be foster carers or kinship carers, through their crisis calls to that service, indicating they don't feel properly equipped
That's
to
right.
deal with those complex issues.
That's right, and I think that's one of the areas we need to better equip our carers, both directly, so to offer them. That's
to
right.
deal with those complex issues.
That's right, and I think that's one of the areas we need, and also assist them to identify where they can go if they need further assistance.
I just ask you one more question on this continuum about the foster carers and kinship carers. Again, earlier in the week we heard from some of those representative groups that they sometimes felt that they didn't have delivered to them or provided to them adequate information about the background of the child or young person that they were expected to care for and respond to, and indeed answer questions from. Is that something that has been brought to your attention?
Yes, it has. So we've heard that for quite some time, that carers feel they're not given all of the available information about children. Certainly in Victoria, we've been...
And obviously in particular in the area of the child or young person's background,
Yes.
relevant to this inquiry of being either the victim of sexual abuse or indeed potentially a perpetrator.
That's correct. So carers have indicated that they don't feel that all information is shared, and on occasions information about the children's sexually abusive behaviours have not been shared, which leads to a whole range of unacceptable risks. We're very clear with our child protection practitioners that when they are searching or referring a child for an out-of-home care placement, they need to complete referral processes that are robust, and they need to provide all of the available information to our placement coordination staff, the people who bridge the placements for us with community service organisations, so that the best possible match can be found and that carers are equipped with all of the relevant information.
So there's no policy bar, it's falling short in the practice, is that what you mean?
That's correct. I think very more equipped with all of the relevant information.
So there's no policy bar, it's falling short in the practice.
Being passed on. It's generally because of the not a deliberate attempt on behalf of the practitioners to withhold information, but rather in the rush to try and fill out referral forms where a child may need a placement within an hour or two, and to provide information to the Children's Court about where the child's going to be placed, that they've omitted important information. So we've been working with the workforce for some time now to make sure that they consider that information very carefully, and particularly when children have sexually problematic or abusive behaviours, that's always included, so that we can ensure that the caregiving, particularly foster carers and kinship carers where other children may be involved, and residential carers, obviously, they're aware that what risk that child might pose to other children, and what safety planning may need to be developed in order to mitigate those risks if they're placed with other children.
Thank you. Ms Worth, can I ask you, if you are able to to comment on the issue that is occupying some policy time inside the Royal Commission, the issue of disclosures for children and young people and some of the barriers to those disclosures. As to whether or not you have anything that you want to say through your experience about whether or not there are is anything that you think is changing or developing in that area from what the literature has traditionally shown?
I think we've always known it's hard for children to disclose, especially if it's intrafamilial abuse, and probably hard for them if they're in, say, out-of-home care and it's one of the other kids, because the chances are they don't want to get moved. They would just, like as they do at home, want.
And indeed, we heard that from the young people earlier in the week.
Yeah, I can imagine that if they tell, they know someone's going to be moved, and that will be difficult for them. We do something for the Department of Human Services, which we started doing probably 10, 15 years ago, which is specialist assessments. And they're often for younger children, not young people. And they're when there's an understanding that possibly there has been some sexual abuse, and it can be out-of-home care or when someone's in their family. And the department haven't been able to get disclosures, and they still think there's behaviour that indicates there's a problem, or there's been a medical report that suggests there's a problem, and we will actually undertake those. And a specialist assessment is 6 to 8 sessions with a child, which is longer than a couple of disclosure interviews. And we don't call them disclosure interviews, but the truth is they are. They're just sophisticated disclosure interviews, and we'll undertake them over a couple of months. And then we'll write a report with a recommendation. So we found that a useful process for that group of young people, young children who inhabit a grey area when no one's quite sure what's wrong.
About how many of those sorts of referrals would you be getting currently?
We probably get one a week, one every 2 weeks. We don't get a lot of them because we get quite a lot of DHS referrals, but we would get a number, and it's always after there's been a couple of interviews with child protection staff to no avail's not quite right, but they haven't got a disclosure, so no one's quite sure where to go from there. And sometimes we get disclosures and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we find that a child's really distressed, mum and dad have split up, or grandma's died, or something else has happened, which can give you some behaviours that are of concern but don't seem to indicate sexual assault.
Do you want to comment on that area at all, Mr. Tolliday?
On disclosures? Yes. No, I've got nothing to add.
No, nothing that you want to say about that, the changing nature of it. Just one last matter before I ask Commissioner Fitzgerald if he has any questions, and that is about gender breakdown with respect to children engaging in sexually abusive behaviour. And I understood you, Mr. Tolliday, to say that you struggled to get the numbers for a girls' group program. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes, the numbers of girls, or the proportion of girls identified for engaging in sexually harmful behaviour, is fairly steady in New South Wales, at least, at between 7 and 10% of the reports coming in, and slightly higher than that percentage comes into the New Street services because the girls present a very different picture to the boys. They typically have a far more complex trauma history, are in a far less safe position than the boys. So they meet our criteria in prioritising more. So there's a higher than 10% average for the girls, but we then need to, within the numbers of young people at any one site, then we've got an age range between 10 and 17. So that's where it's difficult to actually have a group for girls at a particular site. I should say with the girls, the background is so starkly different. We've done a preliminary review of the trauma that the girls have experienced, And we found that of the nearly 30 girls we looked at who were across our programs at the time that we reviewed this, that all girls had a trauma history. All girls, bar one, had polytrauma, multiple forms of trauma from poly offenders, always with male offenders, sometimes with male and female, and where there was sexual abuse only by male offenders, mostly in care situations. That presents a remarkably different sort of picture on average to the boys.
To the 30 to 40% of boys presenting as having previously been victims.
All have victims of sexual abuse.
Of sexual abuse.
Yes.
Sorry, what's the profile for the boys then?
Well, the boys with the girls, we've virtually got poly abuse by poly offenders for the whole cohort. With boys, it's around 2/3 have got some form of abuse or harm in their background identified at the time of referral to us. So that grows a little after we engage with the boys and find out more about their lives, but it doesn't come anywhere near the significance in terms of the breadth and duration and extent of the harm.
Is that consistent with your service, Ms Worth, with respect to the figures on gender breakdown?
It actually is. We probably see around 5% of our intake are young women. They have all been abused, sexually abused. Certainly all of them, and probably most of the young men, very few not, have a family violence history. So they've come from quite violent family backgrounds, not necessarily with sexual assault, and that would cover nearly everybody.
Thank you. Commissioner Fitzgerald.
Well, if I can just follow on from that, can I just ask this question? It's about what you believe the research and your own experience is telling us about the trajectory for children who were abused in their early teenage years. And the reason I want to put this in the context that in the private sessions we've heard, obviously, the majority of people have been abused historically, and they're coming to us as adults. In the males that are coming forward, an overriding concern for them has been that if they disclose, they would in fact be seen to be a potential perpetrator. And many of them have feared that in fact they would become perpetrators. From their own advice to us, the majority didn't go on to that. What do we now know about the trajectory for children, particularly males, that were abused at an early age? What's the best evidence available at the moment? Ms Worth?
We actually know that most people who are abused don't go on to abuse, and that's
Evidence available at the moment. Ms Worth?
We actually know that, and so we do know that. The research shows that as well. But you're quite right that for men, and obviously that's what people have been telling you, they're terribly worried that they will become perpetrators. They're often worried people thought they were gay if they were in their teens, and that worries them as well. And it's like the Seinfeld thing, not there's anything wrong with that, but it bothers them no end that that's it. And some of the young people we see who are slightly older when they're abused are really bothered they weren't able to, and they use expressions like handle themselves. How did this happen to me? This doesn't happen to real boys or real men. So it gets complex, I think, for the young guys in a way it doesn't for the young women.
But what's the research telling us about it at the moment? We are in fact looking at the research, and we're certainly doing a great deal of work about that. We understand that the majority of people that go on to abuse were not necessarily abused as a child, and that is a change in views over time. What do you think the information, the research is telling us about?
I think that's actually accurate, that most people who abuse do not go on to abuse, and that people abuse for a complex range of reasons. And certainly in the sexually abusive treatment service, most of our young people have been abused. Either they've had family violence or they've been sexually assaulted. But there's a small group who haven't. And we actually struggle to sort of drill down to get some sense of why that is so. Why was that the way they chose to exert power or to make themselves feel better about something? It's very few of them, but it is a small, significant number.
Can I just clarify that? Is it the case, or is your understanding the case, that most, if I can just restrict it to men for the moment, most men who go on to abuse would have been abused? So we know from the research that most boys that are abused do not go on to be abusers. But is it the reverse of that, that most that do abuse, sexually abuse, have in fact been abused themselves as children? Is that what the evidence or research is telling us?
I don't think that's actually true. I think it's a good defence. So generally speaking, lawyers will ask people if they're, arrested for certain things. Were you abused as a kid? They have I suspect they have a checklist of some description, because I know that later in therapy that a number of people will say, well, that wasn't actually quite accurate. I don't think you need to have that as a precursor. I think there are other things that happen for people.
Sure, thanks. Mr. Tolliday, do you have any views on those?
A little. The issue of adults who assault children, whether they have a childhood history of having been abused themselves, is not really settled. There's been some research conducted in Australia by Professor Smallbone in Queensland and his associates with cohort of prisoners. I had 20 years' experience as the director of the Cedar Cottage program in New South Wales, and we would routinely ask the men coming to that service, they were intrafamilial offenders. We found that 2/3 disclosed childhood histories of abuse of some sort that they had experienced, and also in roughly the same proportion a commencement of harming behaviours towards others when they themselves were adolescents. So that was in the context of an intensive treatment process, and those sorts of disclosures occurred 6 or 9 months into that process, compared with graduate research students going into a prison and having a couple of interviews. So it's very hard to get accurate data. So I think it may be overstated in the high end of the research, but I think there is a significant amount of information now to suggest that adults who sexually harm children have themselves experienced some sort of developmental interruption that has facilitated their conduct of this kind as adults. In relation to boys who've been sexually harmed, there are a couple of things in the research space currently that are important to note. One is that sexual assault services in general, in my view, have done poorly at engaging boys in sexual assault counselling. So that's a very significant issue for teenage boys. It may even be that sexual assault services are not where teenage boys may feel most comfortable talking about their experiences. There may need to be some sort of rethink of where and how to deliver services. Now, the significance of this, in my mind, relates to some research that was published, I think last year or perhaps the year before, by Professor Ogloff from Monash University, that comes from data that Margaret Cuttajar used for a PhD, looking at the trajectories of boys identified as being harmed, sexually harmed, and receiving a forensic response in Victoria, I think over a period of up to 40 years or slightly over 40 years. And they found for the boys who were sexually abused in their teenage years, so not from a very young age, in their teenage years, that there were elevated levels of participation in all sorts of adverse outcomes as adults, drug and alcohol, criminal activity, including a slightly increased rate of participation activity of sexually harming others. Now, that's not a significant rise, but it's a significant factor in my mind when I pair it with the issue of the others. Now, that's not a significant rise, but it's a significant factor. The intention of that, in my view, is to provide pathways for boys who are identified as having been sexually harmed into an appropriate process to be able to understand and process their experiences of being abused.
Your observation in relation to young boys being abused and not necessarily accessing the services that are available, is that changing? And I just preface that by the fact that the majority of people that have disclosed to the Royal Commission are males.
Yes.
That have been abused by males. And in that historical context, many of them, most in fact, received almost no support at the time of the abuse. But today we would have expected that to have changed. Is that not the case?
It's certainly generally changing for boys of younger age. For teenage boys, I'm not sure. I really only have my own perceptions, not data. But I think that we do need to have more attention in this space. And I do know that there are some postgrad studies being done by folks here in New South Wales trying to look at this issue at the moment.
Can
Commissioner Milroy.
I just have one follow-on question from that topic about pathways to offending. And given that there's, I guess, a reasonable evidence base now about the fact that other sexual abuse, or in particular family violence or physical abuse, can be a risk factor for later offending behaviour, do you think that information is incorporated into the preventative programs for children coming into care where they've experienced abuse within whatever setting may be the case, or within in and out-of-home care? That understanding of that pathway is incorporated into the counselling or treatment or support programs for children in care.
Do you want to start, Ms Allen?
I think the short answer is yes, it is. I think most people understand that children who have suffered abuse are at higher risk. It's not the sole determinant of them going on to offend or to have necessarily a poor life outcome, but the odds are stacked against them that may occur. Certainly the pathways between child protection and youth justice are being well documented and well researched, and so anything that we can do, we talk about early intervention approaches so that we try and intervene early to get therapeutic services as early as possible to children through mental health services, sexual assault counselling and so forth, so that we try and ameliorate the impacts as much as we possibly can, noting that there's a number of things that we need to do that can provide protections to children who have been abused to stop that longer-term trajectory around offending, and they do include things like positive self-esteem, good solid relationships, therapeutic inputs, things that build resilience for those children and give and restore their sense of self-worth and esteem in the longer term.
So in regard to that then, if it's well understood and there are programs that try and incorporate it into a preventative approach, if I could ask Mr Tolliday and Ms Worth, where has the failure been then in the kids that you are seeing with the sexually abusive behaviours in regard to that preventative approach? Or are they just not being picked up at that early intervention stage?
I actually think for some young people they stayed at home far too long as small children, and I don't think we really understood the part that domestic violence, family violence played in damaging a child, certainly not a decade ago, maybe not 8 years ago, and that we started to get an understanding of that being in a violent situation changes the architecture of your brain as you grow up. I don't think we understood that, so I think some of the young people now who are coming into the service system have been in very difficult situations for a number of years. So I think the failure was one of basically us just not understanding and having a true grasp of the theory, because people didn't have until, there was some research done about brain development. So you would hope that that will change over the next decade.
Okay.
I think recognition and education prior to children, young people being in the position of being considered to need to be in out-of-home care. Now it does include a screening of looking at factors like domestic violence. It's relatively recent, and we could be doing more, in my view, in the space of prevention of children coming into out-of-home care. In New South Wales, when children are at the point of entering the care system, there's a comprehensive health assessment that includes considering matters such as whether it's known the child's been exposed to domestic violence, whether the child has been a victim of sexual assault, whether the child has exhibited sexually harmful behaviours, and if the answers are yes, there's a more comprehensive layer to that assessment, and then that is incorporated into a health plan for those children that's reviewed every 6 months. So for children coming into the system today, we're doing a lot better with focusing specifically and asking questions specifically about those issues at that point of entry. I think we can do better further upstream on those matters though.
So you're hoping that over time they will have an impact and you will eventually get less referrals to your services?
Yes, absolutely. That's the aim.
We'd like to go out of business, really.
But can I just ask this question? The link between physical violence and then sexual offending by a young person. Is it correct that there seems to be more and more evidence that physical violence, in the absence of sexual abuse at the same time, is a significant contributor to childhood sexual abusive conduct or sexually inappropriate conduct?
Yes.
And is this a recent understanding? And again, I just put that in the context of so many of the people that have come to us, particularly those in local residential institutions, suffered very substantial physical abuse. Obviously, they also suffered sexual abuse. But I was just wondering what the current research and evidence is showing in just relation to physical violence. And you've mentioned domestic violence a number of occasions, both of you, in fact, all of you. So what are we understanding about that?
Exposure to domestic violence is the most prominent prior experience, or the highest appearance in relation to boys who sexually harm. It's also been recognised for at least a decade. From my memory from research in the UK originally, exposure and experience of harsh discipline, which of course is physical violence, features prominently in the histories of boys who've engaged in sexually abusive behaviours.
Is there a reason for that? I mean, I don't want to go into detail, but is there a particular reason why that is now seen to be the case, the causal link?
Well, nobody has the causal link. There are various theories and assumptions people have about young people using sexual behaviour to mediate the ongoing traumatic effects and hyper arousal that young people may have if they've been exposed to violence, and finding that sexual behaviours is a way of mediating that temporarily.
And we would work from the theory that it's about they have power and control over something, which is the young people they're abusing, and they didn't have power and control when they were being beaten, basically.
And then I think the gender lens needs to be, put onto this a lot as well, that with regards to particularly young women, who are involved in being exploited sexually. So whilst we may be seeing, more young men who have problem sexual behaviours, we're seeing so many of our young women being part of sexual exploitation, from their very early years up through their teen years, and that being a trajectory that people for many, many years have just seen as, well, that's just going to happen because these are young women in care and this is how they're going to express their sexuality, through relationships or through sexual activity that may not be consenting or equal or mutual. It's for a long time just been accepted that that's what those young women in care will do.
And do you think that's changing?
It's starting to, but I would say that there's been more work that's been starting to be done with the problem sexual behaviour field, and obviously with prevention and acknowledgement of childhood sexual abuse. But it's fairly interesting the way that people seem to change their the way that they work with young people, from the 11, 12, 13 and onwards with regards to sexual behaviours, that people in some ways start to see it as just being, well, it's common, so it's normal. So this is what young women in this community or young men in this community would do, rather than it actually being safe and informed and consensual. We get young people sent to our clinics who are in care, to get contraception when they're actually involved in exploitative sexual relationships, and the answer to that is not to contracept.
I'd probably want to say that that's very, very different in Victoria, to the point where, as I said earlier, we've worked really hard to identify and respond to sexual exploitation very differently, and an independent review that we've commissioned earlier this year has indicated that we're in a very good place, I think, in terms of the developments that Victoria's undertaken over the course of the last 5 or 6 years.
Can you just identify that independent?
We're in a very good place, I think, in terms of the developments that Victoria's undertaken over the course. We're the authors of that review, and they.
And you have that review now, do you?
We do, yes, yes.
And I would agree with that. It's so important that we learn from each other and that we know more about this. And Victoria certainly is moving, and has moved a lot further. So that is true.
But can I just ask that question? When we had the panel of non-government institutions and government institutions in the first hearing of this particular case study, sexual exploitation came up by everyone as a current, contemporary and increasing problem. Now, we do know that sexual exploitation took place in institutional care previously, but all of those agencies we spoke to indicated their concern about the increase in sexual exploitation today, and it was recognised that Victoria seems to lead the nation in terms of responding to that. Is that your experience in the field, that sexual exploitation is an increasing problem, or are you seeing no change in patterns?
I think it is an increasing problem, somewhat related to the internet and the ease of access to young people. I think it was harder 20, 40, 50 years ago, unless they were in an institution, to actually access young people. Now you can go on Facebook, and most young people are on Facebook or its equivalent, and I think people actually know to trawl through and offer them various inducements to meet and get involved in things. And if you've got an unattached young person, male or female, they, you know, these people who actually pimp them are basically very good at attaching.
And I think another thing that we haven't spoken about today, but is also the issues for young people who might identify as, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or questioning. You know, we know that those young people are overrepresented in the care system as well, and that there's huge risks for them in this system as well if we're not going to recognise that their requirements with regard to sexual safety, sexual information, the fact that they exist and that they're important, it can't be overlooked, because, we're working with a lot of young people who may identify as gender or sexual diverse, who don't see themselves written in at all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Furness?
No, nothing further.
Nothing arising from any of that. Thank you very much to the panel for your attendance and cooperation with the Royal Commission, and you're now otherwise excused. I don't think we have a panel this afternoon, do we?
No, Your Honour. The next panel is at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, and that's the Children's Commissioners and Guardians. And there's two panels, both the same type of membership, although obviously the individuals differ. And then on Friday we have two Ombudsman panels.
Thank you. So we'll adjourn now until 10 tomorrow.
Thank you, Your Honour.